stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about the Shandon family, particularly the twins Neville and Roger. The likeness between the twins went even deeper than the surface. Both owed their success in life to a certain hardness of character coupled with an abundance of energy. Neville, going to the bar, had made himself feared from the first as a brutal and domineering cross-examiner, and his criminal practice had done little to soften his professional manners. Roger's rise to prosperity had been more mysterious. It was vaguely known that he had made money in South Africa and South America, but the exact methods which had led to his fortune were never discussed by him. He had come home at the age of 45 to find his brother one of the leading lights of the bar. The purchase of the little Whistlefield estate had followed, and Roger had apparently been content to settle down in the countryside and make a clean break with the interests of his past. It's strange the murderer didn't leave some trace, then. I'd have expected to find him using a thread to guide him out of the maze, like Theseus in the labyrinth. He paused for a moment, then added, but perhaps he rolled it up as he went out, so as to leave nothing behind. He rose as he spoke and put his last questions. Do you suspect anyone in this matter, Mr. Shandon? Was there anyone in the background whom we haven't heard about? A woman, for instance? Ernest Shandon seemed to ponder these queries in his dull way. No, he said at last, I don't think so. Not to my knowledge, at least. Of course my brothers had their own affairs, but that's to be expected in families, isn't it? I mean, they didn't tell me everything, of course. But bar this Shackleton business, I can't say I ever heard anything that would fit the case. No, I can't remember ever hearing anything of the sort. The chief constable wasted no further time. I shall have to come back again, Mr. Shandon. Will you think over the matter meanwhile and take a note of anything you think likely to help us? And you also, he added, turning to the rest of the group. As the door was closing behind him and Wendover, he heard Ernest's verdict, delivered in a disconsolate tone. This'll be an infernal bother. In the hall, they found Costock in charge of a constable and apparently re-signed to his detention. When questioned, he added but little to the story which he had told earlier in the day to Stenness. What brought you to this neighborhood at all? Sir Clinton demanded. You don't expect us to believe that you came here by pure chance, do you? No, Costock admitted. If I was pitching a yarn to a flatty or to an ordinary busy, I'd say that, and I'd stick to it. But you know a bit too much about me, Driffield, and it wouldn't take with you. So I'll just take and tell you the truth, so I will. Sir Clinton's smile showed more than a touch of unbelief. Make it the whole truth, when you're at it, he advised, and begin by explaining how you happen to be here at this particular period. Well, you see, this Shandon man, Roger, he owed me something, so he did. He didn't play straight with me out at Kimberley. So you came home as soon as you got out, to blackmail him? That's obvious. You needn't protest, Costock. It's really not of any importance, for I'm quite convinced that you didn't reach the stage of negotiations, so there's no harm done. You put up in the village, waiting for a chance to see him alone, I suppose? Costock nodded. And now explain how you came to be in at the death, please. It was this way. As I was going through the village I came on a boatman. It's a hot day, so I thought I'd go on the river for a row. And perhaps spy out the land, seeing that the grounds are easily accessible from the riverbank. Well, I don't say yes and I don't say no. It might have come in handy. And you took a pistol with you on your outing? Costock had his explanation ready. I thought as perhaps I'd run across Shandon and we might get talking. He's a violent-tempered swine, leastways, he was so. And 't seemed to me best to have a quietener in my pocket, for I'd have stood no chance at all against him, man to man. He could licked me with one hand. When did you leave the boathouse in the village? 'Bout 3 o'clock, as near as I can remember. But the boatman could tell you. He took the time for hearing the boat. You came up the river fairly slowly, then, And what happened after that? As I came along, I noticed a little private boathouse and a landing stage. I knew that would be Shandon's place, for I'd asked the boatman about it. Just as I was coming abreast of it, I heard some yells, so I stopped rowing and let the boat drift. Then I heard someone squalling murder at the pitch of his voice, behind some hedges near by the water. So I pulled in, hitched up my boat, and ran through the nearest hole in the hedge. And then I got tangled up in that fandango of a thing they have there, what they call the maze. You didn't see anyone running away from the maze before you got in? No. Did you run about in the maze or did you walk? Costock considered for a moment or two. I walked. Once I was inside, I got tangled up, as I told you, and I didn't want to be running round corners slap into a murderer. And then? Oh, after that I heard a lot of shouting and a girl screaming and all that sort of thing. But I was that tangled up I could get nowhere. I'd got fair lost in that infernal monkey puzzle. Sir Clinton turned to Wendover. This fellow was searched, wasn't he? Yes. Nothing on him but the pistol, and we took that away. Sir Clinton turned back to Costock. You can go now, but you'll have to stay in the village for a day or two. You'll be wanted at the inquest. I may as well tell you that you'll be watched, so it's no use trying to bolt. He dismissed the XIDB with scant ceremony, handed his dog over to the care of the constable with orders to take it to the Grange, and then went down the steps to Wendover's car. Chapter 6. The Toxicologist. The next port of call, Squire, will be Dr. Ardsley's, Sir Clinton informed his companion as they seated themselves in the car, and you can put a bit of hurry into it, if you like. Wendover's appearance had earned him the kindly nickname which the chief constable used. He was one of those red-faced, hearty country gentlemen who, on first acquaintance, give an entirely erroneous impression of themselves. Met casually, he might quite easily have appeared to be a slightly fussy person of very limited intellect and even more restricted interests, but behind that facade lived a fairly acute brain which took a certain sly delight in exaggerating the misleading mannerisms. Wendover was anything but a fool, though he liked to pose as one. "All right," he said, as the pace of the car increased. "It won't take long to get there. But what do you know about Ardsley? Never mentioned him to you, so far as I can remember." "Well, don't put off any longer. Tell me something about him now," suggested Sir Clinton. "All I know is that he's an expert in poisons or something of that sort." Wendover pricked up his ears. "Poisons, says you? You don't think?" But Sir Clinton was not to be drawn so easily. "You're quite right, Squire. I don't think. I never caught the knack of it, somehow. Just tell me all about Ardsley, will you, and put it in a nutshell, for we haven't much time." "Ardsley?" Wendover ruminated. "Ardsley's one of these damned vivisectionists. Doesn't even need to do it for a living, either, just cuts up dogs and cats for pleasure, I suppose, since he's got a private income. He's one of these cold-blooded beggars, all brains and no emotions, and that sort of thing. Swarms up mountains for amusement, they say, quite good at it, too. Member of Alpine Club, I believe. He's a good fisherman, got an eye like a hawk and seems to have the devil's own luck in clearing the streams round about here. He had a row with Roger Shandon over that, I remember." He pondered for a moment. "That seems all about Ardsley." A fresh subject occurred to him. "Not arresting anybody yet, Clinton? Seems funny to have 2 murders and no arrests. Aren't you afraid of letting the fellow slip through your fingers?" "Not very," the chief constable reassured him. "I'm having Costock shadowed. I gave instructions to the constable about it. The rest of the Whistlefield people can't budge either, for they'll be wanted at the inquest to give evidence. But the fellow might bolt in the meanwhile. He may, assuming he's one of the house crowd. But if he's one of them, he'll have to be fairly smart. I've got photographs of all the ones who were at the maze, took them under pretense of needing someone to give the scale in the pictures. A photograph's better than a description, you know." Wendover was silent for a few seconds. "I suppose you're going to Ardsley about the poison on the darts?" Partly that, partly to gather impressions, if you must know. Oh, well, he ought to be able to spot the thing for you. They say he's written a book on poisonology or whatever they call it. Toxicology is the word you're dredging for, I think. Well, toxicology, then. That reminds me, do you think? Never. Quite against my strictest principles. Tomorrow I shall spend a penny on the local paper. I shall read up what the crime expert in it has got to say. Then I shall know all about it. Why should I bother to think? Wendover thought that he had surprised the chief constable's subject of speculation. In spite of the hints he had received, he persisted in his probing. Then you think that Ardsley may be? There's a law of libel, Squire, and you're just twittering on the edge of it at present. I tell you bluntly that I have no definite ideas just now, and you'll get nothing by all this hydraulic pump business that you're trying. If I ever get to the bottom of this affair, I promise you I'll spout like an artesian well of information. Till then, the borings will show no results. Wendover accepted the rebuff placidly. Sir Clinton was grateful, and showed it by his next words. The fact is, Squire, I'm keeping an open mind and I don't want to be prejudiced. It's as clear as print that you dislike this man Ardsley. Hence it wouldn't pay me to listen to you unconsciously discrediting him beforehand. I tell you what. We'll discuss the thing tonight when I've got my mind cleared up a bit, and then you can say what you like. But I don't promise to give you much information, remember. I'm paid to keep my mouth shut so long as a quiet tongue is necessary, and I've got to earn my pay, you see. Wendover's face cleared when this point of view was put before him. You can't put it fairer than that, Clinton, he admitted. I hadn't looked at it quite in that light, you know. He said no more at the time, and soon the car reached the entrance to the toxicologist's grounds. At the house they learned that Dr. Ardsley was at home, and they were shown into a room. He did not keep them waiting long. As he came forward to meet them, Sir Clinton saw a man of about 50. Ardsley's hair was silvered, and his face showed heavy lines, but his step was light and he was obviously in perfect condition. From below heavy eyebrows his grey eyes seemed to examine the world coldly, and the set of his mouth was sufficient to show more than a little toughness in the disposition which had moulded it. Sir Clinton rapidly explained the cause of his visit, and producing the box of darts, he handed one of them to the toxicologist. I'm not sufficiently ignorant to expect you to tell me what this stuff is on the spur of the moment, Dr. Ardsley, but I'm really trusting to luck that you may be able to make a guess at what the thing might be. If you can do even that, it may be of great importance to us. Ardsley took the dart and examined it for a moment or two. Then he put questions about the state of the bodies and the times, which Sir Clinton was able to furnish. He said at last. I think, from what you say, that I might make a guess at it. It's obviously one of these arrow poisons or something of that sort, perhaps a strophanthus derivative or a member of the strychnose group. Can you give me anything more definite? Sir Clinton demanded, rather anxiously. Time's the main factor with me just now. I know these vegetable things are the very devil to spot, but it's honestly a matter of life or death, and I want something definite if you can give me it. Ardsley frowned slightly as he examined the dart. Can you spare this? I mean, to examine it, chemically, and otherwise. I can't promise to let you have it back intact, you know. Give me information, that's all I ask. Very good. He paused for a moment. You won't want to let this out of your sight, I suppose. Then you'd better come along to my laboratory. Luckily I have a guinea pig in stock. He glanced under his eyebrows at Wendover. You'd rather stay here, I should think, Wendover. You dislike vivisection. I'm only going to put a needle into the little beast, quite painless, but you needn't come and get your feelings rasped. It was phrased politely enough, but it was quite evident from the way in which it was said that Ardsley had no desire to let Wendover into his laboratory. Leaving the squire to kick his heels, the toxicologist led Sir Clinton through the house to the research department. We'd better see exactly what phenomena the poison produces, first of all. I'll get the guinea pig. He washed some of the poison from the dart with liquid, and introduced the solution into a hypodermic syringe, by means of which he injected a minute amount of the fluid under the guinea pig's skin. "Dead already?" Sir Clinton asked in some astonishment. "It's like a thunderbolt." Ardsley had been experimenting on the animal and watching closely. His face showed that he had found something definite. "I think I can make a guess," he said. "It happens to be something with which I'm fairly familiar. Let's confirm it." He made another extraction of the poison which he placed in a test tube. To this he added a few drops of solution from a bottle which he took down from a shelf. "Sulfur-vanadic acid," he explained. "Just watch." On the addition of the reagent, the liquid in the test tube turned black. It ought to change to dark blue, and then to red after a time. "What do you make of it?" Sir Clinton demanded. "Curare. I'm pretty sure of it. I've used it a lot and I feel fairly safe in saying that. Of course, if you want me to swear to it, that's a different matter. This is only a rough test. I'd need to do a lot more before I could go into the box and testify about it." Sir Clinton nodded. "Of course, I know it by name," he said. "South American arrow poison, isn't it? Can you tell me anything more about it?" Ardsley was engaged in writing some notes. He looked up apologetically for a moment. "I have to enter up details of each experiment I carry out, you know, Sir Clinton, even if it's only a case of pricking a beast with a needle. If you don't mind, I'll finish this entry. I like to have things always shipshape in that line, and the more so since I've got the police on the premises." He smiled, not altogether pleasantly, as he turned again to his writing. When he had finished, he suggested that they should rejoin Wendover. "I'm not going to give you a lecture on curare," he said, when they had returned to the other room, "but 1 or 2 points may be of use to you. It's a South American arrow poison, as you said. Its physiological effect is a powerful paralyzing action on the motor nerve endings supplying striated muscle, but it has no action on the excitability of the muscle. You saw the actual results in that experiment." "I guessed something of the sort from the state of the two bodies," Sir Clinton explained. "It was pretty clear that neither of them had struggled much before they died. I put that down to the swift action of the poison, but from what you say, they must have been paralyzed when the stuff got into the bloodstream." Ardsley made no comment, but continued his exposition. "It wouldn't require a large dose to kill a man. Curare contains various alkaloids. Paracurarine and protocurarine are amongst them. 1/4 of a grain of protocurarine would kill a 10-stone man quite easily. There was far more than a fatal dose of curare on that dart. Can you tell us anything about how the stuff comes on the market?" Sir Clinton inquired. "There are 3 brands of it to be had," the toxicologist explained. "Paracurare you can buy in bamboo tubes, calabash curare is packed in gourds, and what they call pot curare is sold in earthenware pots. The stuff's a crude product, you understand. One specimen differs from another to some extent, though not materially for most purposes. You have some of it in stock yourself for your experiments, perhaps?" Ardsley smiled rather grimly. "A man isn't required to incriminate himself, is he? But I don't mind admitting that I have some of the stuff. You could have found that out for yourself by examining my returns under the Act, you know, so I lose nothing by frankness." Sir Clinton acknowledged the underlying meaning of Ardsley's words by a faint shrug of his shoulders, a completely noncommittal gesture. "You practically told me you had it, there in the laboratory," he reminded the toxicologist. "What's more important at present is to know if anyone else could have had access to it." Ardsley reflected for a moment or two before speaking again. "There's another source of supply close at hand," he said, as though the point had just come to his memory. "Roger Shandon had a sort of museum up at Whistlefield, stuff he had picked up on his travels, rubbish mostly. But I remember he had a pot of curare amongst it." "Ah. That's what I wanted to get at," Sir Clinton broke in. "You're sure about that?" "Quite. It slipped my memory at the time, but I'm quite certain about it. It's real stuff, undoubtedly. I remember that once, a while ago, I ran short of curare and I borrowed Roger's specimen and took some of it. I returned it to him at once, of course, and I only took a trace for use. But it's real curare all right, without any doubt. And that stuff's lying up at Whistlefield now? Is it under lock and key? No, Ardsley explained. It's just lying loose in an open museum case. Anyone could lay their hands on it. Sir Clinton's face showed perplexity. It's time that we're up against, he repeated, and he seemed to be making some unsatisfactory calculation. I wish I'd known about that stuff an hour ago. He turned to Wendover. Look here, you must do this for me. I've other things to attend to which must be put through immediately. Will you take Dr. Ardsley up in your car to Whistlefield? He'll identify the pot of curare for you, you couldn't be sure of it yourself. And then take charge of it. Quote me, if anyone raises objections. And make a note of who objects, if anyone does. Now it's a matter of hurry, and more hurry. You must get that stuff into your hands without a second's delay, Wendover. The toxicologist wasted no time. I'll get my coat now, he said, going towards the door. We must stop any chance of further supplies at once, just in case of more trouble, Sir Clinton said, when their host had left the room. Wendover was plainly astonished. Do you expect another crime? Surely two's enough? One never knows, Sir Clinton affirmed, with a hint of trouble in his tone. I'd never forgive myself if I neglected the possibility, even though it's a very remote one. One can't bring dead men back to life with a few regrets, you know. Ardsley put his head in at the door. I'm ready. Then let's get off, said Sir Clinton. Drop me in the village as we pass, Wendover, I've something to do there. I'll join you at Whistlefield as quick as I can. Wait for me there. Now drive for all you're worth. As they came into the village, Sir Clinton gave a sigh of relief. Shop's still open, I see. That's all right. He got down from the car. Now, off you go. Don't waste a moment. As the car moved off, the chief constable glanced along the street and then, with deliberate restraint, he lounged over to the door of the local ironmonger. All traces of hurry had disappeared. He seemed merely a casual purchaser. Good evening, he said pleasantly to the man behind the counter. You seem to stock a fairly wide selection of things, to judge by your window. I'm looking for a small drill, if you have one on the premises. Could you let me see one or two? The ironmonger, it seemed, kept such things in stock. Sir Clinton examined them. This seems to be what I want, he said at last. Have you a brace to fit it? He fitted the drill to the brace, took out a penny and tried the drill. Then, with the hole half bored, he seemed to lose interest in the matter. You don't stock airgun slugs, do you? As a matter of fact, we do, sir. Mr. Hawkhurst of Whistlefield uses a lot of them, and he persuaded me to keep a stock of them. Nobody else has any need for them, but he buys quite a lot from time to time. Perhaps you keep darts, too? Yes, I've got some in stock. Sir Clinton considered for a moment. Let's see. I'll take 100 slugs and a couple of dozen darts. You might put the whole lot in one parcel, I'll take the brace and drill as well. While the man was packing up the articles, Sir Clinton made inquiries as to the position of the druggist's shop in the village, and on leaving the ironmonger's he made his way to it. Let's see, he reflected aloud, after he had had a few words with the druggist on local gossip. I'll have a pennyworth of Condy's fluid crystals. They're a good antiseptic, aren't they? And about threepence worth of some carbolic solution, too. Have you any litmus, by any chance? The solid stuff is what I want. It happened that the druggist had all these in stock. That will be all tonight, sir? He inquired, as Sir Clinton took the packets and paid for his purchases. That will be all for the present, said the chief constable absent-mindedly, and he left the shop after saying good evening. He made his way to the police station, where the sergeant in charge, recognizing him, came forward at once. Have you a room here that I can have to myself for 10 minutes or so, Sergeant? Yes, Sir Clinton. This way. This will do all right, the chief constable said, after a glance at the place. By the way, Sergeant, send a man out at once to get me a small table vice, you know these portable things, at the ironmonger's. I saw one in the window as I passed. And wait a moment, can you smoke navy cut? Good. Then get a couple of small tins as well. Considerably mystified, the sergeant executed his orders, and when the various articles had been procured, Sir Clinton closed the door behind him and set to work. His task took him rather longer than he expected, but at last it was done to his satisfaction. He called his subordinate in again. A glass of water, Sergeant, if you please. When this was brought, he shut the door again. Some minutes later he came out and called the sergeant. Here's your navy cut, Sergeant. I'm sorry I can't give you the tins. The sergeant, completely at a loss to understand these proceedings, thanked him in a dazed fashion and began to sweep the tobacco from the table into his pouch. How far is it to Whistlefield? Sir Clinton inquired. On learning the distance he borrowed a bicycle from one of the constables. Send up to Whistlefield for it tomorrow, or in an hour, if you like. I'll leave word that you're to get it. And with that the chief constable mounted the machine and rode off. The sergeant watched him out of sight and then returned into the police station. He entered the room which Sir Clinton had been using and looked at the debris of the unknown experiment. He's had something clipped in that vice, I suppose. And there's a drill, I wonder where he picked that up. And he's got some pinky stuff in that glass of water, too. And he takes away the tins and he leaves the tobacco to me. This is a rum kind of chief constable to have, for sure. What's he getting at? Chapter 7. The Pot of Curari. After leaving the chief constable in the village, Wendover took the road to Whistlefield. Sir Clinton's obvious anxiety had impressed him, and he drove fast. He was not altogether pleased at having Ardsley thrust upon him as a companion, for he disliked the toxicologist. Whenever he saw Ardsley's grim, clean-shaven face he had a vision of tortured animals, and a spasm of repugnance attacked him. His knowledge of the Vivisection Act was negligible, and his imagination pictured helpless beasts strapped to tables and writhing under the knife of the vivisector. For politeness' sake, he forced himself to make conversation. "It's to be hoped we can manage this for Driffield without a hitch," he said. "He seems to be afraid of leaving the stuff lying loose. You can find it all right, I suppose?" "I can go straight to the place where it used to be kept," Ardsley assured him coldly, paying no attention to the speculative part of Wendover's speech. He seemed to feel no desire to continue the conversation, and Wendover felt that he had suffered a snub. "Surly devil," he commented inwardly. "He won't even meet one halfway." He had no time to brood over the matter, however, for very soon they reached Whistlefield. "You'd better do the talking," Ardsley advised, as they got out of the car and approached the door of the house. Wendover nodded in agreement and rang the bell. When the maid appeared he asked if Ernest Shandon was disengaged. The maid seemed doubtful. "He's in the study, sir, and he left word that he wasn't to be disturbed." Wendover thought of asking for the secretary, but it struck him that since they had come to commandeer the drug, it would be best to see one of the family. After all, it was private property, even if it was dangerous stuff. "Is Mr. Hawkhurst at home?" The maid showed them into a room and asked them to wait until she could find him. "If he isn't, then ask Miss Hawkhurst to see us for a moment if she can," Wendover directed. In a few moments, Arthur Hawkhurst entered the room, looking rather surprised when he saw who his two visitors were. "Fairly travelling round and seeing the country, aren't you, Wendover? Morbid curiosity, I think, haunting the scene of crime like this." He nodded to Ardsley. Quite obviously the double murder had not affected his spirits to any extent. Wendover was not much surprised. The boy had never been a favourite with either of his uncles, and though he seemed lacking in decent respect for the victims, Wendover put it down to Arthur's slightly unbalanced mentality. "I'd have preferred a shade less cheeriness, I must say," he thought to himself, "but I suppose it would have been mere hypocrisy in his case, and one must make some allowance for his brain being a bit abnormal just now." He came to the point at once. "We've been sent up by Sir Clinton Driffield to see if something is in that museum of your uncle's. He wants to know if it's been removed by any chance." "What the devil does he know about the museum?" demanded Arthur. "He never saw it when he was here in the afternoon. What does he want with it anyway? And what is it that he does want? Does he think one of the blokes upstairs had offended one of the Mayan idols and got a settler by way of squaring the account?" "No," Wendover said, hastily. "Nothing of that sort." "Well, what is it then? I'll get it for you." "Don't trouble, please. Dr. Ardsley knows the look of it, and it will be easiest for us to go to the museum and look round ourselves." "Oh, indeed." Arthur grew distinctly hostile. "You seem to take a good deal on yourselves. Why not wait till you're asked, before wandering about in people's houses?" Wendover felt that the matter was becoming awkward. The boy seemed to have flown into a passion, one of these storms of emotion to which he had been subject since his illness. And then another thought crossed Wendover's mind, though he tried to dismiss it. Why should Arthur be so anxious to prevent them entering the museum? Corari had not been mentioned. Surely young Hawkhurst could have no suspicion of what they wanted, and yet he seemed determined to put difficulties in the way. It was with great relief that he saw Sylvia come into the room. After greeting her, he turned away from Arthur and explained the matter to the girl. "Of course. Come along at once," she invited them, ignoring Arthur's lowering face. "Anything we can do to clear up this miserable affair ought to be done." She led them through the house to the museum. It was, as Ardsley had said, mainly filled with rubbish, odds and ends which might possibly call up recollections in the mind which had gathered the stuff, but of very little interest to a casual visitor. It was a miscellany of souvenirs rather than a museum, and the items seemed to be lying on the shelves without any system whatever. Ardsley evidently knew exactly where to go. Leaving the others, he moved across to one of the cases on the wall, opened it, and took down from a shelf a little pot of unbaked earthenware. Arthur had followed him suspiciously. "What's that you're doing?" he demanded, abruptly. "The chief constable asked me to find this for him," Ardsley replied, examining the material in the pot as he spoke. "You're not taking any of it, are you?" Young Hawkhurst put the question with obvious distrust. He had his eyes fixed on the toxicologist's hands, as though he feared that Ardsley might remove some of the stuff under their very eyes. "No," Ardsley retorted, with a certain sharpness in his tone. "I've nothing further to do with it." He handed the little vessel to Wendover as he spoke, and seemed to dissociate himself from any further connection with the matter. Arthur's eyes fixed themselves on the pot. He was still, apparently, disturbed by the way things were going. "I don't care about this way of doing things," he complained. "Here you come along. For all we know, you've no authority whatever behind you. And you go straight to this stuff and want to take it away with you, by the look of it. I know what it is. It's Corari, Indian arrow poison. And you propose calmly to walk off with it. We can't have that sort of thing. It's dangerous stuff. You've no right to take it, I object." Wendover tried to throw oil on the waters. "We aren't going to take it away," he explained, turning to Sylvia. "Sir Clinton asked us to pick it out, that's all. He'll be here shortly and you can learn from himself what he intends to do. But in any case, I think it ought to be in a safer place than this. As you say," he turned again to Arthur, "it's dangerous stuff." Sylvia agreed immediately. "It was rather careless to leave it about like that if it's poisonous," she confirmed. Wendover's mind had been busy in the meanwhile. He had noted for Sir Clinton's benefit that Arthur evidently knew the nature of the stuff, although there was no label on the specimen. If Arthur knew, then the chances were that other people knew also. He glanced at the contents of the pot in his hand, and he thought he could detect that some of the stuff had been removed. The original surface seemed to have been disturbed. Then he remembered that Ardsley had volunteered an account of how he had run short of Corari and had taken some of Roger's specimen. That might account for the disturbance. Another thought occurred to him, and he asked permission to inspect the museum. "Do you mind if I look round the shelves?" he asked Sylvia. "I've never been in this place before, you know. Your uncle seems to have collected a lot of specimens." Sylvia accompanied him in his tour of inspection, but she could throw little light on the various objects. "Hardly anything's labeled, as you see," she pointed out. "Once or twice I offered to label them all for Uncle Roger, for it seems so silly to have a lot of things there with no explanation, doesn't it?" They moved down the room, scanning the shelves. Ardsley remained near the door, grimly aloof from the rest of the group. Arthur hovered uncertainly about the room, evidently keeping his eye on the visitors as though troubled by suspicions of their motives. "This is a dreadful business about my uncles," Sylvia said in a low voice, when she and Wendover had moved away from the others. "I was terribly shocked when I got back here and heard what had happened. I'm not going to pretend I was very fond of either of them. They always seemed to me different from the rest of us, somehow, but I liked them in a way, and it was horrible to come back and find that while I'd been enjoying myself in the afternoon, they'd been—" She hesitated, evidently disliking the word, "murdered." Wendover nodded understandingly. He quite appreciated her feelings. Neither of the dead men had been of the type that would attract the admiration or even the respect of a girl like Sylvia. Their disappearance would leave no real gap in her world. But after all, they were relations of hers, and the sudden incursion of violence and death into her family was bound to leave its impression. "You're not frightened, are you?" he asked. "No, of course not. But it seems a frightful affair, doesn't it? It leaves one dazed, somehow, like a bad dream. Only one doesn't wake up. We all seem to be going about trying to persuade ourselves that the world's just the same as ever, but somehow I don't seem to succeed. It's too horrible for that." Wendover did his best to soothe her. Behind the pretense of indifference he could see that she was badly shaken. Quite obviously she was trying to minimize her feelings so as not to make him uncomfortable. They continued their tour of the collection, and she tried to interest herself in explaining to him the various objects in it. When they had completed their inspection, Wendover suppressed a sigh of relief. "Well," he said to himself, "there are no poisoned arrows there, at any rate. This pot of stuff seems to be the only danger point in the whole lot." He bent his efforts to infusing at least a semblance of harmony into the company, but it was not a very successful attempt. Sylvia seconded him to the best of her ability, but Arthur still maintained his suspicious attitude, and Ardsley seemed disinclined to emerge from his state of unfriendly neutrality. It was a relief to them all when the door of the museum opened and Ernest Shandon ushered in the chief constable. Stenness followed close on their heels. "This is Sir Clinton Driffield, Miss Hawkhurst," Wendover hastened to say, when he remembered that they had not met in the afternoon. Sir Clinton bowed to the girl and then, with a word of apology, he turned to Wendover. "Got the stuff?" he demanded, and his face cleared when Wendover held up the little earthenware pot. A glance at Ardsley confirmed that it was the right thing, and Sir Clinton seemed to pay no further attention to it at the moment. "I'm afraid I disturbed your uncle, Miss Hawkhurst. He was busy in the study, and I was rather loath to interrupt him, but he very kindly came out at once." Ernest, in the background, fumbled for a moment with his eyeglasses. "I was very busy," he admitted. "But of course I wasn't so busy that I couldn't stop. In fact, I was just turning over papers and going through the safe with Stenness. It wasn't really important, or at least not so important that it couldn't be put aside for a time, and Sir Clinton said he wasn't going to stay more than a few minutes. So I just left things, of course. I'd just been looking over Roger's will. We happened to come across it on the top of a pile of things in the safe. I couldn't understand it, to tell you the truth. These lawyers are terrible fellows for putting in long words, like hereinafter and heritable and movable and accretion, and so on. And all about survivor or survivors and beneficiaries and a lot of complicated things besides. If it hadn't been for Stenness, I don't think I could have made out what it was all about." He blinked helplessly at the group, and then continued with a tinge of pride in his tone. "Roger made me one of his trustees. Neville was another of them. And there's a third, the head of his firm of lawyers, I think, or at any rate, a lawyer. Then, in a rather discouraged voice. "I suppose that'll mean a lot of bother, signing papers and all that sort of thing." Sir Clinton waited patiently for the end of Ernest's speech, and then he came to the point at once. "If you're an executor that simplifies matters, Mr. Shandon, I want to take away this article here." He indicated the pot in Wendover's hand, "but only for a day or two, probably. You'll get it back again in due course. It's only a loan, you understand." Ernest evidently felt the dignity of his new position. He put out his hand for the pot, examined it carefully through his glasses, then handed it over to Sir Clinton, though with a certain reluctance. "Have I any right to part with it, Stenness? You know what the will says." "There's no reason why you shouldn't, Mr. Shandon," the secretary reassured him. "Besides, if the chief constable wants it in connection with this afternoon's affair," he glanced interrogatively at Sir Clinton, "I've no doubt he could get power to take it, whether you want to give it up or not." Ernest seemed to feel that he had got into deeper waters than he cared about. "Well, if Stenness says that, I suppose it's all right. He understood the will and he ought to know. He explained it all to me very carefully just a few minutes ago, so he knows what's what. I could understand him all right. Why can't lawyers use plain language like Stenness, instead of wrapping it all up in hereinafters and aforesaids? It's a stupid sort of way to write. I can't think what they do it for." Rather to Wendover's surprise, Sir Clinton showed no great eagerness to be gone. He pulled from his pocket the tin box which had been found in the maze and slowly removed the cover. "You're an expert with air guns, I think, Mr. Hawkhurst?" he asked pleasantly, as though appealing to an authority. "Would you mind having a look at these things and telling me what you make of them? Don't touch the points," he added quickly. "They're very dangerous." Arthur Hawkhurst had been listening with a frown to Sir Clinton's negotiations for the pot of Corari, but he seemed to be flattered by the chief constable's direct appeal to him. He came forward, took the box in his hand, and examined the contents minutely. "May I take one out to look at it?" "Of course, but be careful," Sir Clinton agreed. Arthur removed one of the darts and inspected it. They seemed to be just ordinary pattern air gun darts. They'd fit any of the guns we have. But someone seems to have been monkeying with them, boring holes in them and filling them up with some dirt or other. And the feathering's all filthy, too. He completed his examination and handed the box back to Sir Clinton. "Anybody else claim to be an expert?" asked the chief constable. Sylvia looked at the tiny missiles with a shudder. "They're just ordinary darts so far as I can see," she said. "And was it one of these things that killed my uncles? They seem such harmless little things. I fired them often and often at targets myself. One would never dream they could be deadly." Sir Clinton closed the box and put it down on the mantelpiece behind him. He seemed suddenly to have been struck by a fresh idea. "You said any of the guns we have, Mr. Hawkhurst. I'd like to know how many air guns you have on the premises." Arthur looked at him distrustfully. "I can't tell you on the spot," he admitted, grudgingly. "We have half a dozen that I could lay my hands on, but we've got more than that lying about somewhere or other. They get left in odd places. The gardeners sometimes use them for shooting rats for amusement and so on, and one never knows where the guns are till one asks for them." Sir Clinton seemed rather taken aback. "You seem to have a regular armory," he said. "I'm keen on air guns," Arthur explained. "You're not going to take them away, are you?" Sir Clinton waved the suggestion aside at once. "Of course not. I only asked out of curiosity. I knew you were interested." Arthur seemed to be relieved by this. "Oh, that's all right," he said in a much more cordial tone. "So long as you leave me one of them, it'll do all I want. Now, Dr. Ardsley, if you'll just show me where this pot used to stand, I think we shall be able to go," Sir Clinton said, turning to another matter and dismissing the air gun question. At this, Ernest came forward. "I think I can show you where it stood," he volunteered. "I remember Roger bringing it back from South Africa. He used to keep it on a shelf in his study in his last house, I remember, the third shelf from the top, to the right of the door. Then when he came here, he had such a lot of stuff that he'd collected that he found he'd got to make a museum of it, so he put it all together in this room. I've been over it all with him, I helped him to arrange it, I remember. But it seemed to me very dull. Not a bit interesting. But, of course, if you like, I could show it to you and tell you all about it. Perhaps it might interest you, though I found it dull. People's tastes differ so much. One never can tell, can one? Ardsley had paid no attention to Ernest's flood of information. He had gone down to the proper shelf and now he pointed out the empty space to Sir Clinton. The chief constable examined the place carefully, but said nothing. At length he went to the windows of the room and inspected the catches. Anyone could have got in here without much trouble, he commented. You don't seem much afraid of burglars, Mr. Shandon. No, Ernest admitted, refixing his eyeglasses with care and looking wisely at the window fastenings. You see, we've never had any burglary here. It may seem strange, for of course Whistlepield's a bit isolated and it might be a good place to burgle. I never burgled myself, you know, so I don't really know about these things. There's a lot of silver, of course, he added. Perhaps it is strange that we never had a burglary. Now I come to think of it, it would be quite an easy house to get into. We ought to have burglar alarms put on. Really, things are an awful bother. Can you recommend a good burglar alarm, Sir Clinton? The chief constable deprecated the proposed task with a smile. Really, Mr. Shandon, I've had no particular experience. You'd better have a look at a few and choose the one you think most satisfactory. Ernest's face expressed as clearly as print his inward comment, more trouble. I don't know, Sir Clinton, perhaps I'd better get some. But then, you know, he added with a touch of relief, we've never had a burglary yet. Hardly worthwhile fitting alarms, perhaps. It's such a nuisance getting the things, and then getting workmen up to fit them, turn the whole place upside down and all that, and then having to remember to set them at night before one goes to bed. You don't think it's worthwhile, do you? He ended, hopefully. Sir Clinton shook his head. You're in charge now, Mr. Shandon, you know. You must do what you think best yourself. He turned to Ardsley and Wendover. I think we must be getting on the road again. They took their leave and got into Wendover's car again. We'll drop you at your house, said Sir Clinton to the toxicologist. It was very good of you to take all this trouble to help us. I feel a good deal easier in my mind now that I've got this. He tapped the little jar of curare which he had brought away with him. Chapter 8. Opportunity, Method, and Motive. Wendover picked up the decanter and poured out some whiskey for his guest. You can't complain that I've worried you with questions, Clinton, but I think you might tell me something about this business at the maze. You seem to have definite ideas, and I'd like to know what they are. He glanced at the tumbler as he spoke, then added. In vino veritas, you know. Sir Clinton looked up with a quizzical expression on his face. Truth at the bottom of the decanter, eh? He inquired. Well, if that's the method you can give me just 2 fingers and all the soda. The truth's sometimes dangerous when it's undiluted. And, remember, I warned you frankly that it might not be convenient to tell you very much just at present. The arrangement was that you were to give your views and I was to say what I thought of them. Wendover acknowledged the accuracy of this. At least you might give me something in the way of general principles, though. They aren't hush-hush matters, at any rate. Sir Clinton came over, lifted his tumbler, and went back again to his seat before replying. That's true enough, he admitted. But I don't think general principles are likely to take you far in this case. I can make you a present of them without giving much away. Wendover poured out his own whiskey and soda and returned to his chair. Go on, he said. Make a lecture of it, if you like. The night's still young. I've a good mind to take you at your word, and you'll have only yourself to thank if it bores you. To begin with, then, there are 3 basic points on which a prosecutor has to satisfy the judge, or the jury, if it's a jury case. These are opportunity, method, and motive. It isn't absolutely necessary to prove motive, But one does what one can to establish it if possible. A jury might be chary of convicting unless they saw something of the sort. You might expand that a bit, Wendover suggested. All you've given me is 3 words. Take them one by one, Sir Clinton went on. First of all, opportunity. The accused man must be somebody who had a real chance of committing the crime, somebody who isn't excluded by ordinary physical impossibilities. If a body with its throat freshly cut were to fall into this room at the present moment, it would be no use trying to bring a case against the Mikado or the President of the United States. We know that they're thousands of miles away at this time. It would be physically impossible for them to have done the trick. That's self-evident, said Wendover. A murderer's bound to have been on the spot when he committed his murder. Not necessarily, Sir Clinton contradicted at once. A poisoner needn't be near his victim when the victim dies. He might have sent poisoned chocolates by post or something like that. But he must have had the opportunity of committing the crime, whether he was on the spot or not. You couldn't have accused Robinson Crusoe in a poisoned chocolates case, he was outside the postal radius. Wendover nodded in agreement. But in this particular case at the maze, he commented, it's pretty plain that the murderer was on the spot all right. The person who killed the Shandons was somebody who was in or near the maze between 3 and 4 o'clock this afternoon. Sir Clinton passed to his second point. Method is the next thing. It's an axiom that the more ordinary the method of killing is, the more difficult it is to spot the murderer. Suppose you find a body in a by street and it turns out that the man has been stabbed to death. What have you to go on? Not much. But if you find somebody poisoned with some fairly out-of-the-way alkaloid, then you limit the number of possible murderers very considerably. You remember the Crippen case. Divergence from the normal is the weakest link in a murderer's chainmail. Well, you ought to be happy in this affair. You've got a sufficiently out-of-the-way method. That's so, Sir Clinton admitted. But what you gain on the swings you sometimes lose on the roundabouts, you know. The method in this case was one that either a man or a woman could have used. Even a child can pull a trigger. That extends the range a bit. But a child would need to have had the chance of getting at the Korari. And the Korari has been lying open to anyone for the last year or 2. Don't forget that. Then you think it was the stuff up at the house that was used? I don't think anything about it at present. All I wanted was to shut off that possible source of supply. Then you must be expecting more murders. Sir Clinton appeared not to hear the query. Suppose we come to motives now. Barring very exceptional cases, there are really only 5 motives that make it worthwhile to commit murder: women, money, revenge, fear, and homicidal mania. And I should think that in most cases if you go deep enough you'd find either women or money at the back of the business. Wendover reflected for a time, evidently conning over the possibilities. It doesn't seem to be women this time, so far as things have gone, he suggested at last. Sir Clinton refused to be drawn. I must confess, he said, that I have a sneaking admiration for the Shandon's murderer, at least so far as his brains go. Could you imagine a better place for murder than the maze? Absolute privacy guaranteed by the nature of the affair. No one could see through those hedges. The murderer can creep up to within lethal distance, come almost face to face with his victim, and yet remain absolutely invisible. And when the job's done, he can sneak off in perfect safety. No one can swear to seeing him. If he's found in the maze, he can explain that he heard a cry for help and rushed to assist. It was a brainy lad who hit on that locale for his crime. Wendover thought he had put his finger on a weak spot. But that limits the number of possible murderers still further, surely. It would need to be a fellow who knew the maze intimately, otherwise he'd have got tied up in it. Sir Clinton smiled a trifle derisively. Didn't you hear me inquire about that at Whistlefield? The maze is open day and night. Anyone could learn all about it, and no one would be much the wiser, since it's in an outlying part of the grounds. A man could come up the river in a boat, drop into it, and cut a whole series of private marks on the hedges to guide him to the center, bend twigs or something like that, which wouldn't give away the fact that he'd been at work. Or he could even bring in a thread and trail it behind him to help him out again, and roll it up as he retreated. No, you can't bank much on that point, Squire. Well, who did it, then? Demanded Wendover, exasperated by the upsetting of his idea. Sir Clinton looked up with something suspiciously like a grin on his face. It might have been anybody, he said, oracularly. But it seems more likely that it was somebody, if you catch my meaning. Wendover betrayed no pique at this indirect discomfiture. One doesn't get much out of you, that's clear, he responded ruefully. Sir Clinton seemed to feel that he might say something further without breaking through his self-imposed limitations. What's wrong with your outlook on the business, Squire, is that you want to treat a real crime as if it were a bit clipped out of a detective novel. In a tech yarn, you get everything nicely sifted for you. The author puts down only things that are relevant to the story. If he didn't select his materials, his book would be far too long and no one would have the patience to plow through it. The result is that the important clues are thrown up as if they had a spotlight on them, if the reader happens to have any intelligence. He paused to light a cigarette before he continued. In real life, he went on, there isn't any of this kind of simplification. You get a mass of stuff thrown at your head in the way of evidence, and in the end 9/10 of it usually turns out to be completely irrelevant. You've got to sift the grain from the chaff yourself, with no author to do the rough work for you. Do you remember the map game? Wendover shook his head. I don't recognize it from the title. You must have played it sometime or other when you were a kid, Sir Clinton continued. One player chooses a name on a map, the other player's got to find out which name it is. He can ask any questions he likes, provided that the first player can answer them by a plain yes or a no. Now that game is something like detective work, though the problem's much easier to solve. Curiously enough, the really clever player doesn't choose a name in tiny type, only the beginner does that. The expert picks out some name like France, or Germany, or Czechoslovakia, something that stretches halfway across the map. Then when the opponent asks, is it on this half of the map? The expert answers no, quite truthfully, and the beginner at once assumes that it must be in the other half and proceeds accordingly, quite forgetting that it may be on both halves simultaneously. That's the kind of thing that may turn up in criminal hunting. The fellow you're after may be, in fact he generally is, playing two parts simultaneously. He's not only a criminal, he's a normal member of society as well, at least in murder cases he usually is. He stretches over both halves of the map, you see? And if you insist on looking at one half only, you miss him completely. That's a long suit of talk you had in your hand, Wendover commented. You seem very flush of information on some points. Sir Clinton laughed, admitting the hit. You asked for a lecture, and now it seems you don't care for it when you get it. Well, try your hand yourself. Let's hear what you've made of the case. I'm not afraid of prejudice now. Wendover glanced at his friend with some suspicion, but he seemed reassured by what he saw. Sir Clinton appeared to be quite anxious to hear his ideas. If you're not pulling my leg, I don't mind, he said. I've taken in most of what you said, and that limits things down a good deal. I'll take the possibles, one by one, and consider them. The bother is that it's difficult to find any one person who will fit into your three classes, I mean someone who had an opportunity, the method, and a motive strong enough. Sir Clinton knocked the ash from his cigarette. Go on, he said. Let's see how you get round that snag. I'll represent a jury of average intelligence, if I can screw myself up to that pitch. Well, first of all, Wendover suggested, there's this Hackleton case looming in the background. Now that Neville Shandon's done for, Hackleton stands to win. It was a fight between them. Shandon was depending more on his brains than on his witnesses, I take it, and now that he's out of it Hackleton will get off scot-free. There's your motive all right. Sir Clinton nodded his assent to this, and Wendover continued with rather more confidence. The method used was obviously a sound one, no matter where the murder was done. An air gun's fairly silent, and that Corari evidently kills quickly. It's not the sort of thing an ordinary rough would think of. Even if he did think of it he couldn't get the poison. But Hackleton's got money enough to buy some unscrupulous fellow with brains, and this gone-under intellectual might have hit on the trick. Or Hackleton himself may have devised it and passed it on to his tool. That's so. And then? The fact that the murder was done in the maze may have been mere accident. They may have intended to get at Neville Shandon anywhere they could, and it just happened that he went into the maze and gave them the best chance there. You assume, of course, that they would have got up the topography of the estate, maze included, beforehand? I'd have done so myself if I'd been put to that job, so I suppose they'd have had enough sense to do it, too. But why was it a double murder, then? Demanded Sir Clinton. How did Roger come into the business? Wendover pondered for a moment, then he seemed to see a solution. Perhaps they had two murderers at work and each of them imagined he'd got the right man in front of him. The two Shandons were very much alike, you know. Sir Clinton nodded without committing himself. Pass along to the next caravan. What's the next animal on show in your menagerie? I'm a bit doubtful about young Hawkhurst, to tell you the truth. I hardly like to think that he did it, and yet after that attack of sleepy sickness he certainly did turn very queer in his temper. You'd have seen a finer outburst if you'd been with us when we went up for the Kurari. And there's no disguising the fact that he and Roger didn't get on together at all. Given an unbalanced mind and that state of affairs, one has to admit that queer results might turn up. What do you make of the opportunity factor in his case? All we have is his own word that he was up at the spinney shooting rabbits. For all we know, he may have been in the maze. He knows it thoroughly. All the family do, of course. He thought in silence for a moment or two, then added. And of course he's very keen on air guns, and he knew of the store of Kurari in the house. You've made out quite a fair case against both Hackleton and young Hawkhurst as suspects, Squire, but there isn't a tittle of evidence there that a jury would look at, you know. Oh, I see that well enough, Wendover admitted. But the case against other people isn't half as strong. Ardsley's a possible suspect. He has possession of Kurari, he knows the maze intimately. And he's had a squabble with Roger Shandon over some trifling fishing rights. I'm afraid even Isaac Walton would hardly have thought the matter was a sufficient ground for murder, Squire. Wendover could think of no reply to this on the spur of the moment, and to cover his defeat he hurried on to a fresh group of suspects. Now we come to the people who were actually in the maze at the time of the murder or whom we know to have been in it immediately afterwards: Torrance, Miss Forrest, and that fellow Costock, your I.D.B. friend. I can't see how Miss Forrest had anything to do with it. As to Costock, you know about him and I don't. Yes, said Sir Clinton, I know all about Costock. But he volunteered no further information and waited for Wendover to proceed. That leaves Torrance, then. It's as plain as print that Torrance might have been the murderer. He was in the maze at the time. He arranged to part from the girl at the entrance. He's had plenty of time to learn the maze while he's been down here at Whistlefield. He might have been the person Vera Forrest heard running in the maze just after the murder, quite easily. He didn't take an air gun into the maze with him, Sir Clinton objected. Wendover had his answer ready this time. No, but he might have had it hidden there beforehand. And no air gun was found afterwards. He may have chucked it on to the top of one of the hedges. Your constables couldn't have spotted it there without ladders. That's quite true, said Sir Clinton. Well. Wendover seemed to have a flash of illumination. His face lit up. Now I see what you meant by your map analogy. Of course, the snag is that on the face of it young Torrance had no motive. But suppose he was Hackleton's tool. Suppose he was in the pay of Hackleton to do this job for him. Then it would all fit in. But it'll be the devil of a business to prove it, if it is true. Glancing across at his friend he detected a peculiar expression on Sir Clinton's face. It was only a fleeting one, for almost immediately the chief constable resumed his normal mask. Go on, he said again. Wendover had to confess that he had reached the end of his list. There's nobody else that I can think of. Sylvia Hawkhurst was paying a visit to some people in the afternoon and didn't get home till it was all over. Ernest Shandon was off the premises, too, probably sitting by the roadside and cursing the nail in his boot at the very time his brothers were being murdered. And then there's Stenness. He was up at the house when the affair took place. Miss Forrest found him there when she went to give the alarm. Stenness, said Sir Clinton reflectively. Stenness is a very efficient fellow. Wendover thought he detected something behind the phrase. What do you think? He demanded. Sir Clinton looked at him mildly. I think it's about time we were going to bed, Squire. We may have to be up early tomorrow. At least, I may. Chapter 9. The burglary at Whistlefield. When Sir Clinton came down to breakfast on the following morning, Wendover thought that he looked tired and worried, though he was doing his best to show his normal composure. You look as if you'd been up all night, Clinton, and yet you cleared me off to bed fairly early. The chief constable forced a smile, but it was obvious that he had something on his mind which was troubling him. Not all night, he said, qualifying Wendover's suggestion by a slight emphasis. But I've certainly lost a good deal of sleep over this Whistlefield business. I can't see what you've got to worry about just now, his host retorted. Until one gets more evidence than we have just now, there's nothing that can be done, so far as I can see. You practically admitted as much yourself, last night. Last night and this morning are two different things, Sir Clinton pointed out, rather gloomily. A lot may happen in 6 hours. Well, if they have happened, and you couldn't have prevented them happening. That sounds like a truism, the chief constable commented, and I wish it were one. But it isn't. He seemed almost on the verge of a confidence at last, but to Wendover's disappointment he contented himself with adding. I've taken a big risk in this affair, Squire, and if the game goes against me, I'd never be able to forgive myself. It's as serious as that. From his tone, it was evident that he was gravely perturbed, and Wendover could find nothing to say which seemed likely to be helpful. In a moment or two, Sir Clinton broke the silence. They're on the phone at Whistlefield, aren't they? Yes. Are you expecting a message? One never can tell, was all that Sir Clinton would vouchsafe. Can you hear your telephone bell from this room? Oh, yes, the machine's just down the passage from here, as it happens. Sir Clinton went on with his breakfast, but Wendover could see that he was listening for the ringing of the bell. Just as they had finished, it rang sharply. I'll go, said Sir Clinton. It's almost certain to be Whistlefield ringing up. As he rose from the table, Wendover could see a look of acute anxiety on his face. He left the door open as he went out, and the sound of his voice at the telephone came back into the room. Driffield speaking. Did you say burglar or burglars? All right, don't bother to tell me any more now. I'm coming across at once. Goodbye. Sir Clinton came back to Wendover. The anxiety on his face was as deeply marked as ever, but the prospect of action seemed to have raised his spirits slightly. Come on, Wendover. Get the car out, will you? There's been a burglary at Whistlefield last night. I'll need to go across and look into the affair. When they reached Whistlefield, they were shown into the study where they found Ernest Shandon and Stenness waiting for them. Now you might give me the whole story, Mr. Shandon, Sir Clinton requested as soon as he had greeted the two. It may be a case where time means a good deal, and we want to get our hands on these fellows at once, if we can. Ernest pulled out his cigarette case. He seemed to be in a very nervous condition. Do you mind if I smoke? He demanded, perfunctorily. It soothes one, I always think, gives you a better chance of putting things calmly and not getting mixed up in your story. He peered thoughtfully into his case for a second or two before he could make up his mind which cigarette to take, but at last he found one to his mind and set it alight. Wendover fidgeted slightly, but Sir Clinton evidently recognized the uselessness of trying to hasten Ernest in his operations. There's been a burglary here last night, he announced at last. Or rather, when I say last night, I really mean this morning because it was a good deal after midnight when it happened. Can you give me the exact time? Sir Clinton asked. Ernest looked at him owlishly, reflected for a moment or two, and then shook his head in a careworn fashion. No, I don't think so. I didn't look at the clock, you know. It was after midnight, that's all I can remember. Begin at the beginning, then, Mr. Shandon, and give us all the details you can. Anything may turn out to be useful for all we can tell. I usually go to bed quite early, Ernest began, but last night, after you went away, I thought I would have another look over Roger's papers. You interrupted me, you remember, he said, as though in explanation of his activity. I got quite interested in some of them. Roger had so many irons in the fire. I hadn't realized before what an amount of energy he must have had. You've no idea of the amount of things he was mixed up in. Yes? Said Sir Clinton, trying to hasten the slow progress of the narrative. Such an amount of things, Ernest went on. It took me all my time to make head or tail of the papers I looked at. I must have been hours and hours, turning them over and reading bits here and there, files of correspondence and that sort of thing. His checkbook stubs were there, too, and I looked at them. I'd no idea so much cash passed through his hands, no idea at all. By the way, I noticed something funny about his last checkbook. I'll tell you about that again, though. It was rum, I thought, but I'd better be getting on with the story. Sir Clinton nodded patiently and waited for more. I'd just been looking over the checkbook when I heard a noise, Ernest pursued. Of course, in an old house like this one often hears sounds at night, furniture cracking and doors rattling, and all that sort of thing, so I didn't pay any attention to it at the time. It was only afterwards that I remembered I'd heard it, and perhaps it had nothing to do with the burglary at all. I just mention it, because you said I was to give you all the details I could, you know. What sort of sound was it? Sir Clinton asked. Ernest looked bewildered. What sort of sound was it? He repeated. Oh, a noise, you know. A. He seemed to find the English language too limited. It was a sound, you understand. A voice? Suggested Sir Clinton. No, not a voice. A sound, just like a snick or a rap or something of that sort, if you see what I mean. And then? Oh, I paid no attention to it. In a house like this one often hears queer noises at night. It didn't really draw my attention. I was interested in this thing about the checkbook. So I didn't trouble about the sound. Wendover was surprised at Sir Clinton's patience, for no sign of boredom appeared on his face. In fact, he seemed keenly interested. The next thing I remember, Ernest continued, was feeling sleepy. I put away the papers, put them all back in the safe again and locked it up. Then I thought I'd go to bed. I always go out for a breath of fresh air before I go to my room at night, if it isn't raining, so I went to the window and looked out. It was quite dry, so I made up my mind to go for my usual stroll. I don't go far, you know, just up and down a little near the house. It seems to me that a breath of fresh air clears your lungs and makes you sleep better after you've had it. I'm a great believer in fresh air. I hate sitting in a stuffy room, must have the windows open always. So you went out? Yes. I put on a light overcoat and a cap and I opened the front door. It was locked when I found it. I suppose that's important. Sir Clinton made no audible comment. I went out into the garden and strolled round the house. That took me under the window of the room where Neville, my brother, had been sleeping during his stay here. And, do you know? I found a ladder sticking up against the wall there and resting against Neville's windowsill. And when I looked up, there was the window open. Sir Clinton interrupted him. Was there a light in the room? Ernest blinked hopelessly for a moment or two. Was there a light? There may have been. Did I say anything about a light to you, Stennes, when I waked you up? No? Well, I don't think there was a light. There may have been, but now I come to think of it, I don't remember seeing a light. No, I'm almost sure the electric light wasn't on in the room. I'd have noticed that. I'd have seen that at once. No, there was no light. Wendover intervened with a suggestion. Perhaps the burglars heard you coming and switched off. Sir Clinton had evidently heard all he wished to know about the light. And what happened next, Mr. Shandon? When I came to the bottom of the ladder, I said to myself, burglars. You remember you'd been talking about how easy it would be to get into Whistlefield, that very night, in the museum. Then I had an idea. I took away the ladder as quietly as I could. That would prevent them getting out of the window again, you see? And then I went off back to the front door, let myself in, and roused Shandon and young Torrance. I was very nervous, you understand. Anyone might be, after getting a surprise like that. He took a fresh cigarette and lighted it with care. As he was about to continue his narrative, Sir Clinton arrested him and turned to Shandon. Perhaps you could give us your experiences, Mr. Shandon. I'd gone to bed at the usual time, and fell asleep. I was waked up by someone knocking at my door, and when I got up I found it was Mr. Shandon. He said there were burglars in the room that Mr. Neville Shandon's body was lying in. Mr. Shandon had on a cap and a light overcoat. As soon as he had waked me, he went off to wake Mr. Torrance. I looked at my watch. It was 2:35 a.m. I picked up the poker from my fireside and went out of my room. Mr. Torrance was there, too, by that time. I suggested that he had better get a poker as well, or else go down to the gun room and get something better. He got a poker. Then all three of us went to Neville Shandon's room. The door was locked, but we burst it in without making much of a noise. It's an old door, and the lock fitted very poorly. There was no light on in the room when I got to it. I'm almost sure, now I think over it, that there wasn't any light at the window, Ernest began again. I couldn't have helped seeing it, could I? Of course, all the rest of the house was dark, so if that window was dark it wouldn't catch my eye and I wouldn't remember about it. But if it had been lit up, I'd have noticed it at once. Shandon took no notice of the interruption. Somebody had evidently been in the room. Everything was upside down. All the drawers had been ransacked and their contents had been thrown about. Neville Shandon's attaché case had been treated in the same way. The whole place was in confusion. Did you make out what the thieves had been searching for? Well, his writing case had been torn open and most of the contents had been strewn about the floor. They'd been in a great hurry over their work. And his pocketbook was pitched over into one corner of the room as if someone had been through the contents and had chucked it away. What about money? His note case was lying on the dressing table. I put it there myself when I searched his body yesterday. Some notes were lying on the floor amongst the rest of the stuff. I didn't count them. In fact, I didn't touch anything. I thought you'd better see things as they were. The window was still open? Yes. It looks as though the burglar, or burglars, had got away before Mr. Shandon saw the ladder, then. They'd cleared out and left the ladder in position. What about the key of the door? It hasn't turned up. And what happened after that? Why didn't you ring up the police at once? Shandon suppressed a sardonic smile with evident difficulty. Mr. Shandon was to look after that part. I went back to my room, put on some clothes, and kept myself awake by reading till the morning. We hadn't roused the rest of the people in the house. Sir Clinton turned to Ernest. Couldn't you get through to the police station, Mr. Shandon? I must see about this. It's a serious matter for my subordinates. Ernest seemed completely taken aback by this view of the question. Well, Sir Clinton, I suppose I ought to have rung up the police, but it was very late, you know. I was awfully sleepy, and as I was walking along, I turned into my own bedroom. I was very shaken up by the whole affair. It hasn't happened to me before, you see. And somehow, I must have begun to undress quite without thinking about it. You know how one does things unconsciously. Then, with disarming frankness, he admitted the truth. I went to bed. And after a minute or two, I remembered I ought to have rung up the police. But that would have meant getting out of bed again and putting on some clothes to go down to the phone. It would have been a lot of trouble. And it didn't seem to me that it mattered very much really. So while I was thinking about it, I fell asleep. But I rang you up as soon as I got up this morning." Sir Clinton made no comment on Ernest's methods. He had got all the information he needed apparently, for now he turned to Stenness and suggested that they should go upstairs and look at the scene of the burglary. Neville Shandon's room bore out Stenness's description of it. Everything seemed to have been turned over and left higgledy-piggledy. The floor was littered with a confused mass of clothes, papers, contents of drawers, and other things. It seemed as though the whole place had been searched in frantic haste for some object or other, but whether the seeker had succeeded or not was apparently an insoluble problem. Sir Clinton stepped over to the still open window and examined the sill. "The marks of the ladder ends are there, clear enough," he pointed out to Wendover, "and there's the ladder itself down on the ground." He beckoned Stenness to his side. "One of your own ladders, I suppose?" Stenness examined it. "Yes, I happen to recognize it. The gardeners use it, and it's kept somewhere about the place." "Some soil on the windowsill," Sir Clinton pointed out. "They must have picked it up on their boots from the flower bed where the end of the ladder rests." "There's some on the floor here, as well," Stenness pointed out. "So I see," Sir Clinton confirmed, "but that might have been brought up by Mr. Shandon when you and he came in here. One can't attach much importance to it." He said nothing more, and contented himself with a careful inspection of the room. "I think I've seen all I want to see," he said at last. "By the way, you haven't a key of the maze, have you? I noticed the iron gates at each entrance had locks on them. I want to go down there now and look round." "I can get you a key, I think," Stenness said, doubtfully, "but the place is always left open. It's never been locked at any time, to my knowledge." "Oh, that's all right then," Sir Clinton hastened to say. "Now, Wendover, I think we'll be getting along." A thought seemed to strike him at the last moment. "If you're afraid of being worried by any more burglars, Mr. Shandon, I'll detach a couple of constables to look after Whistlefield. But I really don't think it's the least likely that you'll have any further attempts of the sort. They seem to have made a thorough business of this one, to judge by the state they left the place in." Ernest seemed rather shamefaced at the chief constable's proposal. Quite obviously he recognized that he had not shone as a hero in the business of the night. "No," he replied, "I don't think we need them, Sir Clinton. I think we'll manage without them, really. Of course, one feels a little nervous. I think it's quite understandable, when things have been happening all together like this. But still, I don't think we really need a guard. If you think it's not likely to happen again, I'm quite ready to take your view of it, quite ready, I assure you. As you say, there's no reason why they should come back at all. They must have got what they wanted, they're sure to have got it, I think. No, they're hardly likely to come back again." As they made their way downstairs, Sylvia Hawkhurst met them. "I've been looking for you, Sir Clinton. Guess what you left behind you last night?" Sir Clinton shook his head doubtfully. "I never succeed in these guessing competitions, Miss Hawkhurst. What was it?" "The box of darts. You put it down on the mantelpiece of the museum, and I happened to notice it this morning when I went in." Sir Clinton's face betrayed his annoyance at his blunder. It was so obvious that no one cared to say anything on the subject. "I'll get it for you in a moment," Sylvia said, as she hurried off. Stenness looked at the chief constable, and it seemed as if his estimate of Sir Clinton was undergoing revision. Wendover was completely taken aback by the turn of events. "Here it is," Sylvia said, as she came back to them again. "It was just where you left it. You'd better count the darts to make sure I haven't lost any, though I haven't opened the box at all. I was too much afraid of them." Sir Clinton obeyed and found the total correct. He shut the box carefully and stowed it away in his pocket. "Thanks, Miss Hawkhurst. It was very careless of me. But there's no harm done, since you've taken care of them for me." And after a few words about the affairs of the night, he took his leave. "Take the road to the east gate, Squire," he requested, as Wendover let in the clutch. "You're a bright detective," his friend retorted scornfully. "Here you've been racing and chasing to cut off a possible source of curare, and in the middle of the job you leave a whole tin of lethal darts lying about for Tom, Dick or Harry to pick up. The limit, I'd call it. It was very careless, Sir Clinton admitted, biting his lip. Careless? Wendover echoed, contemptuously. I can't think how you managed to do it. My godfathers. Leaving stuff like that on the mantelpiece. Sir Clinton flushed. Look here, Squire, I can say you were a damned fool, just as often as I need to hear it just now, without your help. You can't guess how I feel about it. Don't rub it in, there's a good chap. Wendover had never seen his friend so disturbed before. He stopped his denunciations at once. In a few moments they reached the maze, and both left the car. Sir Clinton led the way to the entrance through which they had gone on the previous afternoon. I'd better take the lead, said Wendover. I know the maze and you don't. Just follow me. Sir Clinton paid no attention but kept in front. To Wendover's surprise he showed no hesitation, but threaded his way through the labyrinth without difficulty. When he reached the center he turned to his companion. That's merely to show you that anyone can find their way through here if they keep their heads. I memorized the thing as Stennes was guiding us yesterday, first right, third left, and so on. So you see the murderer could have got up it easily enough if he had someone to show him the ropes at the start. He glanced into the center and then passed round to the position of the loophole in the outer hedge. As he did so he gave an exclamation of disgust and passed his hand over his face. Uck! Spider's web got across my mouth. There's any amount of gossamer about here. These hedges must be full of spiders. Beastly things. Coming to the loophole, he examined it carefully as though to discover the range of view from it. Then he made his way to the loophole commanding the second center, which he inspected with equal interest. Now we'll go outside and have another look at the track my dog picked up, he announced, curtly. Wendover followed him once more, and they emerged from the entrance near the river. Sir Clinton walked over to the tree to which the dog had led them, and then, using the scraps of paper scattered on the previous day as his guide, he crossed the grass. Once on the road, he stopped and turned to Wendover. He seemed to be still smarting under the annoyance of his blunder with the darts. That's the murderer's route, you see? He came out of the maze obviously. Then he climbed that tree, I think you said. No doubt he was well out of danger there. No one would think of looking for him up amongst the leaves. And after that he came over here, got into his private aeroplane, and flew off, since the trail stops short. He glanced up and down the road. Just the one place where he could have done it, notice. This bit of the road is concealed from nearly every direction by these banks of rhododendrons round about. Wendover took no notice of the irony. He sympathized with Sir Clinton's feelings. It required no great stretch of imagination to appreciate how a man would feel after making a mistake like that. They walked over to the car and took the road to the east gate. As he drove, Wendover began to fit together the new facts in the Whistlefield case. The more he recalled the state of Neville Shandon's room, the more obvious it grew that the burglar had been searching for a document of some sort. This linked itself in his mind with the torn fragment of Neville's notes which had been found in his hand after death. And Roger's room had not been burgled. It looks like Hackleton at work, he uttered, half unconsciously. Sir Clinton seemed to come out of a savage reverie at the words. Hackleton? Oh, you mean the burglary? It fits neatly in, doesn't it? Then, in a more friendly voice than he had used since the dart incident. I'm sorry if I rubbed you on the raw, Squire. But you know how I hate to look like a fool, and that's exactly what I do look like just now. Wendover was eager to accept the advance. He had no desire to irritate his friend. After all, everyone makes mistakes sooner or later. But as they fell into talk again a fresh idea shot through his mind, and this time he did not utter it aloud. Clinton hustled me off early to bed last night. He was washed out looking this morning. He hinted he'd done something or other that was risky. What if he was the burglar himself? But though he puzzled over this view of the case, it yielded very little help to him. At last he put it to the back of his mind, ready for future reference if needed. Sir Clinton had one further surprise for him as they reached the Grange. "Would you mind, Squire, if somebody brings a glass of boiling water, some vinegar, and some washing soda to my room as soon as possible? I'd like to have them now." Chapter 10. The third attack in the maze. When Sir Clinton came down from his room, Wendover noticed that he had mastered his vexation. During lunch, both of them avoided the Whistlefield case by tacit consent, but the Squire was relieved to see that his friend's face showed less anxiety in its expression than had been obvious at the breakfast table. Sir Clinton usually had complete control of his features and showed no more than he wished the world to see, and Wendover guessed that behind the mask the Chief Constable was still too sensitive to make the affair at Whistlefield a safe subject of conversation. When lunch was over, Sir Clinton smoked a cigarette for a minute or two in silence. Then he turned to his host. "You might lend me your car, Squire. I ought to go down to the police station this afternoon and get some reports from the man in charge. It isn't worth your while to come with me. They'll only be formal affairs, I suspect, and if there's anything striking, I'll tell you about it when I get back." Wendover consented. His tact suggested that Sir Clinton would probably prefer to be alone until the first edge of his irritation had worn off. When the Chief Constable returned, however, he had little news of importance. "There's no sign of the burglars so far," he admitted. "I rang up the police from Whistlefield in the morning and put them on the alert, but they've picked up nothing that looks like the shadow of a clue. One could hardly expect it. Thanks to friend Ernest's lethargic habits, a burglar could have got to the Midlands before my men even knew of the Whistlefield affair. I suppose they've done all they can? For a local lot handling a thing of this sort, they've really done very well. They've made inquiries at all the railway stations in the neighbourhood and drawn blank. No suspicious person can be traced there. They've done their best in the matter of motors, too, but that, of course, was rather a washout. One can't expect them to keep tally of every car that might pass along the road. And they've had a regular hunt through the Whistlefield gardens to find out how the burglary was done. But there again they struck a blank end." "Footmarks on the flower bed?" inquired Wendover. "One or two beautifully rectangular impressions, that's all. The fellow evidently tied bits of cardboard under his shoes. One hasn't even an idea of the size of his foot. And of course friend Ernest had been stamping about all over the bed in his efforts to remove the ladder with least trouble to himself. He didn't exaggerate when he said he was nervous. It seems he just gave the thing a push and let it fall anyhow, smashed some flowers to bits in the collapse. If the burglars were still in the room above, the row must have put them on the alert at once. You think they may have got away to the house and been hidden there while Stennes and company were breaking into the room? Well, you can lock a door from either side, can't you?" Wendover reflected for a moment. It's a pity Stennes didn't think of searching the house when they found no one in the room. Much too late by that time, Squire. No hunted burglar would wait on the premises a second longer than he could help. He'd be off downstairs at once and get out of the ground floor windows on the opposite side of the house. But then he'd leave an unlatched window behind him. So he may have done. No one can swear that all the windows were made fast yesterday evening. They're a careless lot up at Whistlefield. Wendover's mind fastened upon the thing which seemed to him of most importance. What did the burglar want? What was he after, Clinton? Sir Clinton's face became inscrutable, though Wendover could not help seeing irony in his reply. What song the sirens sang, or what name Achilles assumed when he hid himself among women, though puzzling questions are not beyond all conjecture, he quoted. Sir Thomas Browne knew what he was talking about. What thing the burglar sought, though puzzling is not beyond conjecture, Squire. The field's open, if you wish to enter for the competition. Wendover accepted the irony as a proof that Sir Clinton had got over his fit of annoyance completely. Well, then, I conjecture that the burglar was in Hackleton's pay, like the murderer, and that he was hunting for more of Neville Shandon's notes for the case. Look how everything was turned upside down. Look at the fact that the money was left intact. That wasn't what one expects from a normal burglar. No, it wasn't, Sir Clinton agreed. But I'm not going to be drawn. Go on with your conjecturing, Squire, and if that fails you might take to surmising or speculating as a change of occupation. Thinking exercises the brain, so you won't really lose in the end. You're an exasperating beast at times, Clinton, Wendover affirmed, without a trace of irritation. If that's the first result of thinking, I don't think I'd take it up as a hobby, Sir Clinton responded cheerfully. It might lead to peevishness among the neighbours. He walked over to the window, possibly to conceal his expression, before communicating his next piece of information. I had time to drop in on your friend Ardsley, too, on my way home. Wendover rose to the bait at once. Oh, indeed. I hope he showed you his best specimens, a pithed frog, perhaps, or a mangled dog? It's no good lifting these eyebrows of yours, Clinton. I don't like the fellow. One could almost guess it from the way you talk. But bear in mind, Squire, that even the meanest of God's creatures may have its uses. I've got a use for Ardsley, he added carelessly, so don't go making things too unpleasant if you come across him any time. Wendover gave a half-suppressed growl. One rubs up against a lot of queer fish when one begins mixing with the police, it seems, he complained, half in fun and half in earnest. Before Sir Clinton could reply, the bell of the telephone rang sharply. Bet you 9-4 that's Whistlefield ringing up, the chief constable offered. Here, I'll go myself. He left the room and Wendover waited uneasily for the result of the conversation. It took a minute or two and he knew from this that it must be something relating to Whistlefield, for Sir Clinton had no friends in the neighbourhood. When the chief constable returned, Wendover looked up with a certain foreboding. News from Whistlefield of late had never been encouraging, and he feared that something more might have happened. Did you take that bet? Inquired Sir Clinton. If so, you owe me a note or two. It was Whistlefield at the other end of the line, just as I expected. If this goes on, we may as well tell the exchange to leave their plug in our hole permanently and save bother to all hands. What's happened now? Demanded Wendover anxiously. An attempted murder this time. Your friend Ernest rang up to tell me about it. They've tried to get him next, but he fled like a lamb from the slaughter and seems to have saved his bacon. But he's in a pitiable state, Sir Clinton went on, a tingle of contempt coming into his tone. Quite blue with funk, I should judge. He nearly wept into the mouthpiece, and I could hear him gasping for breath at the other end of the wire. Quite a shock to his nerves, it appears. We'll have to go across and comfort him. Come along. You don't seem much worried over his troubles, Wendover commented. I've no great use for a cowardly little beast. You should have heard him on the phone, Wendover. Sounded like one of those things they used to run in the Grand Guignol. Even the meanest of God's creatures may have its uses, Wendover quoted, sarcastically. Sir Clinton's temporary cheerfulness seemed to have passed away. That's a true word spoken in jest, no doubt. You're perhaps right after all. We may find a use for even friend Ernest before we're done. But on the face of it, it doesn't look probable, does it? When they reached Whistlefield they were shown at once into the study where they found Ernest in a state of nervous collapse. A siphon and a decanter stood on a tray at his elbow, and the moving surface of the whiskey showed that he had just finished pouring out a drink. As they came in, he poured some more liquor into his empty tumbler. I think I'd leave it at that, Mr. Shandon, Sir Clinton suggested, coolly. We'd better not run any risk of your memory getting confused. Ernest took his hand away from the tumbler obediently. Wendover could see that he was trembling, and he seemed to be in a condition bordering on panic. Now, let's have the story as briefly as possible, if you please, Sir Clinton requested. Ernest looked helplessly round the room for a moment. I can hardly believe I'm safe, he explained. I've had such a time. Dreadful. Yes, tell us about it. After dinner, I thought I'd go down and have a look at the maze, Ernest continued. I hadn't been there, you know, since the affair happened, and I thought I might as well go down and look round the place. I wish I'd never had the idea. Such a time I've had. His eyeglasses slipped askew on his nose and he laboriously set them right before continuing. Damn these things. I must get a new pair. They're always dropping off. Yes? Sir Clinton repeated, patiently. All his levity had vanished, Wendover noticed, now that he had come to real business. After lunch I thought I'd go down to the maze, but it seemed a lot of trouble, going all that distance, and I very nearly gave up the idea. I wish I had. But then I thought of the push bike I keep in the garage. It would be easy enough to pedal down on it. So I got it out and went off by the road that leads to the east gate. He put out his hand tentatively towards the tumbler, but drew it back again at the sight of Sir Clinton's frown. He looked like an overgrown baby caught in the act of mischief. Yes? Sir Clinton repeated once more. I went into the maze, you know, never thinking that anything could possibly happen there. I never dreamed of anything happening, you understand. And I walked through it to Helen's Bower, the place where my brother Roger was murdered, you remember? And when I got there I sat down. I'd come a good way, you see. And I felt that I'd like to sit down. Did you see anyone in or near the maze up to that moment? Asked Sir Clinton. Ernest pondered for a moment or two. His trepidation, far from brightening him, seemed to have made him look duller than ever. No, he said, hesitatingly at last, I can't say I did. I don't remember seeing anyone. And then? Where was I? Oh, yes, I sat down. It was rather hot, and I thought I'd like a seat. I meant to sit there and smoke a cigar before looking round the maze. I sat there for a while, I don't quite know how long. Some time, at least. And then I may have fallen into a doze. The sun was very hot, even when I was in the shade of the hedge, you understand? It makes you sleepy. I suppose I dozed off. Perhaps I was asleep for quite a while. You can't give me anything more exact than that, can you, Mr. Shandon? No, I'm afraid I can't. It was quite a while, though, I feel pretty sure of that. He put out his hand towards the tumbler again. I really think I'd get on better if I had another drink. Sir Clinton looked at him with unconcealed distaste. Then he picked up the tumbler himself. 2 fingers then. He went across to the window and poured away the surplus from Ernest's generously filled glass. Now, come along, Mr. Shandon. The sooner we get your story the sooner I can get to work. You must pull yourself together. Ernest Shandon drank off his whiskey neat and then gave a sigh of relief. I feel better now. I've really had a terrible time. Where was I? Oh, yes, I woke up. Thrilling, said Sir Clinton, brutally. And what next? Wendover could not help seeing that Sir Clinton's temper was wearing thin under the strain of listening to this outpouring of rambling narrative. And this time there was no Stennes who could be turned on to complete the tale. They were dependent entirely on the terror-stricken creature before them. I woke up, Ernest repeated, staring at them with wide-opened eyes as though chronicling some vast convulsion of nature. And just after I woke up I seemed to hear steps somewhere near me. I wasn't very wide awake, you understand? And I sat listening for a moment or two, or it may have been for a little longer than that, he added with an evident effort at exactitude. And I thought to myself it might be young Torrance or Stennes. It couldn't have been the girls, you see? Because they had taken the car and gone off to do some shopping in Ambledown. I know that, because they said they were going there and I wondered why they didn't go to Stanningley, which is nearer. But I suppose they wanted to go to some special shop in Ambledown. There are better shops in Ambledown. A glimpse of the expression on Sir Clinton's face brought him suddenly back to his direct narrative. So I called out, "Who's there?" Just like that, you know. But nobody replied. So I was wondering who it could be, and I was just going to call again when suddenly I heard the noise of an air gun going off, and something whizzed past me as close as that. He indicated a track almost grazing his cheek. I jumped up. I didn't wait to hear any more. I can take the right decision as quick as most people, I assure you, Sir Clinton. I ran as fast as I could to the entrance, and then I heard the fellow reloading the gun. It was dreadful. My blood didn't freeze or anything like that, but I suffered agonies. Quite so, said Sir Clinton soothingly. You were in a blue funk. We quite understand. An alarming situation. And what happened after that? I ran out into the maze. Luckily I'd spotted where the fellow was. He was at the same loophole that he'd used when he killed Roger. Oh, I had all my wits about me. I was really very cool, considering the state of affairs. And then? Then I ran through the maze as hard as I could. Such a time. Fancy having the fellow after me with those darts. He followed you, then? It would be what he would do, wouldn't it? You mean that you didn't actually hear him? No, I didn't hear him. I didn't wait to hear anything. I was so busy getting out of the maze. Of course, I know the maze well, but it's difficult to keep your head in a case like that, very difficult. But I did it, he ended proudly. I got away from the fellow. Never as much as saw him. His glasses slipped off again in the excitement of his peroration, and he adjusted them painfully. These things do give one a lot of bother, he complained. I expect it's the perspiration on my nose, with all that running. I haven't run for years. You got out of the maze safely, then. What next? I got onto my bicycle and rode away as hard as I could. What a blessing I had that machine there, eh? If I hadn't, he might have run me down in the open quite easily. I was quite out of breath. Then I went to the telephone and rang you up at the Grange. I had an idea you'd be there. If you hadn't been, I'd have tried the police station. Quite right, Mr. Shandon. Now there are 1 or 2 points I must have cleared up. First of all, it seems you met no one either going to the maze or coming back from it. Did you shout or call for assistance at all on your way to the house? I couldn't, Ernest admitted, simply. I hadn't any breath left to shout with. You don't understand what it was like, I assure you. Was there no one about? No, Ernest answered after a pause. Arthur had gone off somewhere. He generally seems to go off by himself, quite often one doesn't see him for hours. I don't know where he was. And Torrance was out of the road, too. I can't tell you where he was. Perhaps he'd walked over to Stanningley. Or perhaps he'd gone somewhere else. I haven't seen him since lunchtime. And Mr. Stenness? To Wendover's surprise, the sound of Stenness's name seemed to galvanize Ernest. His terror appeared to increase again, just when it had seemed to be dying down. Stenness. He repeated. Oh, Stenness. He broke off short, as though afraid he had been heard. Just a moment, he muttered, and rose from his chair. Wendover could see that the man's knees were trembling. Ernest walked across to the door, opened it gently, and peered out with a caution which had in it a touch of the ludicrous. Nobody there, he explained, as he came back again. You never know. What's behind this, Mr. Shandon? Sir Clinton demanded, impatiently. If you've any information, it's your duty to give it to me at once. Have you anything to tell me about Mr. Stenness? Ernest made a gesture, appealing piteously for a lowering of Sir Clinton's voice. You remember, he continued, almost in a whisper, that the other night, I mean last night, the night of the burglary, I was going through Roger's papers. I think I told you before that I was doing that, didn't I? And amongst his papers I came across his checkbooks and some stubs. I was looking through these, just to see what things he'd been spending money on, the firms he'd been dealing with, and so forth, you understand? And quite by accident, I noticed something funny. The counterfoil of the last missing check had been cut out of the book. I'd never have noticed it if it hadn't been that I was looking at the numbers. It was cut away very carefully, very neatly indeed, you know. But there was the counterfoil for the check before it numbered something like 60,072, and the next one in the book was numbered 60,074 or some figures like these. There was a missing number in the series. And there was another funny thing. I happened to look at the last bundle of returned checks in Roger's drawer. He hadn't destroyed them, it seems, for some reason or other. I can't think why, myself. But there they were. and one of them was missing from the series. There's nothing mysterious in that, Wendover objected. It may have been a check that went abroad, and hasn't been returned to the bank yet. Your brother had interests overseas. Ernest's dull eyes brightened slightly in triumph. That's where you're wrong, Wendover. That's a mistake. I was curious about the thing, it seemed to me so funny. So I looked up the counterfoil of that missing check in Roger's stub, and it was a check for some hundreds and it was made payable to his stockbrokers. That seemed funnier than ever, didn't it? A check like that would go right back to the bank with no delay. It would be paid in immediately, I'm sure it would. Wouldn't it? Of course, sure to be, you know. Sir Clinton had been following this with keen interest. And where does Mr. Stenness come in? He asked. Ernest looked round the room again as though he feared that Stenness might be concealed somewhere. Well, he said, reluctantly, Stenness had access to Roger's papers. He could have got at this checkbook, I'm sure. Roger was a bit careless, sometimes. I've seen his checkbook lying about on the table often. I remember I saw it last Tuesday, was it? Or was it Wednesday? It was in the morning, I know that. Sir Clinton's face showed uncommon interest now. And you think? He prompted. Ernest poured out another stiff glass of whiskey, this time unchecked by anyone. I can't say I think anything, really. I shouldn't like to go so far as that, you understand. That might be going too far, but I let slip to you that I'd found something funny amongst the checks, last night. I mean, I told you this morning what I'd found last night. Or rather. I understand, said Sir Clinton, rescuing him from his tangle. And Stenness was there when I mentioned it. He knew I'd found some hanky-panky. Sir Clinton leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment or two. I see what's in your mind, Mr. Shandon, he said at length. Well, that can be put straight easily enough. So long as you were the only person who knew of this affair, you might be a danger to the fellow who was responsible for what you call the hanky-panky. It might be worth his while to put you out of the way, silence you, eh? And cover the business up. Ernest's starting eyes showed that he had no liking for such plain discourse. Then, continued Sir Clinton, the remedy's simple. Just tell whoever it is, we needn't drag in names, need we? That you've mentioned the matter to me. Then there will be no point in disturbing you further, you see? You'll be quite safe, once you've done that. Doubly safe, in fact, for any further attack on you would be a bit too suspicious. That's your best course. I never thought of that, said Ernest, gratefully. It's a relief, I can tell you. Such a relief. And you think there'll be no chance of another attack on me? I'd take almost any odds against it, Sir Clinton reassured him. Well, I shall stay inside the house altogether for a week or two, at any rate, Ernest decided, his fears returning suddenly. That ought to be safe enough. He applied himself again to the decanter. Sir Clinton had one last question to put. Where was Stenness while you were down at the maze? Ernest stood with his tumbler arrested on the road to his mouth while he pondered over the matter. I don't know, he admitted finally. I really can't say. I left him here, working at Roger's papers, and I told him I was going to Helensbower. But when I came back again he wasn't here. He'd put the papers away. I don't know where he'd gone. Ah, indeed? Said Sir Clinton ruminatively. But he made no further comment. Chapter 11. The Squire's Theories. We'll have another look at the maze, Squire, if you don't mind stopping there. Wendover nodded. He had expected the suggestion. You didn't seem to overflow with sympathy for Shandon, he commented. Friend Ernest raises my gorge, admitted Sir Clinton frankly. Did you ever see a man in such a state? I never could stand that sort of thing. Then, as though he felt he had been too hard on Ernest, he added perfunctorily, of course, he'd had rather a bad half-hour of it. I admire the restraint of your language, said Wendover with a smile. But, you know, Clinton, I think you're a bit hard on the beggar. What could he do but run? I'd have run myself, and I make no bones about it either. Oh, so would I, Sir Clinton conceded carelessly. It wasn't the running that put my back up. You mean that there's running and running, so to speak? Exactly. Look at the case of that girl who was in the maze when the murders were done, Miss Forrest, I mean. She had just as much right as Ernest to get hysterical. I won't say she was as cool as a cucumber when we saw her, one couldn't expect that. But she kept her nerves in order. She didn't arrive at the house afterwards in a state of whimpering panic. No, that's true, Wendover confirmed. She's worth a dozen of Ernest Shandon at a pinch, that girl. She kept her head and did exactly what was wanted. Quite so. She wasn't thinking of her own skin all the time like friend Ernest. What's all this about Stenness? Wendover demanded. Is it merely some rot that Ernest's squirted out in the middle of his funk, or is there anything in it? Here's the maze, Sir Clinton interrupted, cutting him short. Suppose we postpone discussion till after dinner tonight, Squire. I don't want to be distracted for the next few minutes if you don't mind. They entered the maze and made their way towards Helen's bower. Near the door into it, Wendover stopped suddenly and pointed to the pathway at their feet. Hello. Look, Clinton. There's a bit of black thread lying on the ground. They stooped over it and examined the fibre. Ordinary sewing silk off a reel, obviously, was all that Sir Clinton vouchsafed. Wendover thought he had seen more in the matter. Don't you see what it is, Clinton? Ariadne's clue. It's a thread that the murderer must have been using to find his way out of the maze in a hurry. I showed you before that there's no difficulty in the maze if you've once been taken to the center. Wendover had his answer in readiness. Yes. But suppose you were the murderer, you would have to get out in a hurry, wouldn't you? And you might lose your head. Anybody might get confused in the flurry. So he took the precaution of laying the thread to the exit, and all he had to do was to follow it and reel it up as he went. And this time a bit of it caught somewhere, see, this end's tangled in the hedge, and so broke off and he had to leave it behind. When the Shandons were murdered he probably managed to reel up the whole of it and so left no trace behind him. Sounds plausible, Sir Clinton commented curtly. We may as well collect the specimen, though really there's nothing distinctive about it. One bit of thread's very much like another. Sherlock Holmes might have made more out of it than that, said Wendover, rather resentful at the way his discovery had been treated. Doubtless. But as he isn't here, what can we do? Just bumble along to the best of our poor abilities. That's what I'm doing, Squire. They entered the tiny enclosure of Helen's bower, and Wendover's eye was at once caught by a sparkle from the grass near one of the chairs. He stepped across and picked up a silver cigar case. Sir Clinton held out his hand for it and glanced at the outside. It's got a monogram, E.S., engraved on it, he said. This is obviously friend Ernest's. You remember he said something about smoking a cigar here. He may have laid the case on his knee and jerked it off without noticing it when he started on his marathon for safety. He held the case in his hand and seemed to give careful consideration to some point. At last he came to a decision and turned to Wendover. I think we'll say nothing about this for a day or two, Squire. I may want to send this case up to London to have it examined, perhaps. I can't say yet. But in the meanwhile we'll not mention that we found it. Friend Ernest can take his cigars from the box, in the meantime. That's no great hardship for him. You think the murderer may have picked it up, and you'll get his fingerprints from it? It's a nice smooth surface. Sir Clinton looked up from the case with a gleam of amusement on his features. You're in charge of the speculation, surmise, and conjecture department of this firm, Squire. I'm only a humble clerk in the mum and dumb section, telegraphic address, tongue-tied. Wendover accepted the tacit rebuke without protest. Oh, have it your own way, he said. I forgot I wasn't to expect anything from you. Sir Clinton wrapped the cigar case carefully in his handkerchief and stowed it in his pocket before doing anything further. Now I think we'd better go and have a look at the loophole again, he suggested. though I hardly think it's likely to have changed much since I saw it last. But I have a sort of feeling that Sherlock would have found something there, and perhaps you might be able to spot it, even if I can't. That's the worst of this detective business, one needs an eye for detail, and I never had it. With an air of deep solemnity he led the way to the outer side of the hedge, approached the loophole, and peered into it for a time. No, he admitted finally with a crestfallen air, it seems just the same as it was when I saw it last. He put his hand into the hole, not even a bird's nest or any little thing of that kind, he announced disconsolately. Ah, we need Sherlock, we need Sherlock. He'd have found some cigar ash or something of that sort, no doubt. I can't see it. Have a look yourself, Squire. Rather irritated by the chaff, Wendover stooped and stared into the loophole. He had to confess, however, that he saw nothing in the slightest degree suggestive. No broken twigs where the murderer rested his air gun? Sir Clinton inquired. Have a good look, the price is the same for 2 peeps as for 1. Special terms by the hour, if you care to. Ugh. Damn these spiders. That gossamer's all over the place, filthy, filmy stuff. He rubbed his hand on the hedge while Wendover grinned at his annoyance. Serves you right, Clinton. It'll take your mind off all this persiflage business. Sir Clinton seemed engrossed in removing the remaining filaments from his hand. Pity Sherlock isn't here, he let fall in a regretful tone. He turned into an entomologist of sorts when he retired. Perhaps he could tell us what earthly use spiders can be. They keep down flies, said Wendover, instructively. So they do. Illuminating idea. I wish I'd thought of it myself. They keep down flies. When you've quite finished being funny, perhaps you'll get on with your job, Clinton. You're supposed to be detecting murderers, not delivering lectures on insects. Sir Clinton dropped his jesting tone at once. Quite right. We ought to be getting along to the police station now. Aren't you going to do any more here? No. What about bringing up that dog of yours and seeing if it can do anything? The dog could do nothing in this case, said Sir Clinton, definitely. It would be a mere waste of time. Well, you seem to know your own mind about that, Wendover said rather wonderingly. I suppose you know best. But I'd have thought it worth trying. Sir Clinton made no reply, but led the way through the maze to the car. We'll call at the police station on the road home, Squire, if you'll run us round there. I'm expecting some more reports. And some men must come up here and search for anything left about, not that it really matters. By the way, he added, casually, I suppose you know who the murderer is by this time. Wendover could only express astonishment at the question. Well, you've had every chance, was all that Sir Clinton would vouchsafe. If you know who he is, why don't you arrest him at once? Wendover demanded. There's a big gap between knowing a thing and proving it, said Sir Clinton, cautiously. At the police station the chief constable got out of the car and went in to interview his subordinates. In a minute or 2 he was back again, with some papers in his hands, and they drove on to the Grange. I've just time to ring up Ardsley before going upstairs, he said, when they arrived, and he disappeared in the direction of the telephone. Wendover noticed that this time Sir Clinton closed the door of the room behind him, instead of leaving it ajar as he had done on the previous occasions, so that no sound came out during the conversation. I wonder what he's up to with that confounded Jack the Ripper, Wendover speculated uneasily, as he went upstairs to dress. Well, perhaps he'll tell me something after dinner. But when they had settled themselves in their easy chairs after dinner, he found that Sir Clinton evidently intended to reverse the roles. Now then, Squire, you're under no restraint of official secrecy. What do you make of the affair so far? I see. I'm to be Watson, and then you'll prove what an ass I am. I'm not over keen. Sir Clinton hastened to reassure him. I'm not going to poke fun at you merely for the sake of making you uncomfortable, Squire. It would really be some help if I could see the thing from a fresh point of view. Lord knows, I'm not infallible, and you may quite easily hit on something that'll put a new light on things and prevent me making a bad mistake. The obvious sincerity of this was enough to placate Wendover. He had been cogitating deeply over the Whistlefield affair, and he felt that if he could not suggest a provable solution of the mystery, at least he could bring a reasonable amount of criticism to bear on the available evidence. What we have to account for, he began, are, first, the murder of the two Shandons, second, the burglary, third, the attack on Ernest Shandon, and, fourth, the so-called hanky-panky with a check. That's correct, Sir Clinton agreed. But suppose we leave out the check affair at present. We really know nothing definite about it yet. Wendover was dissatisfied with this ruling. It seems to me an essential part in the scheme of things. Let me put the case as I see it. Hackleton is at the back of the whole affair, I take it, but he's been employing an agent, and that agent has been going beyond Hackleton's instructions and has been operating on his own to a certain extent. I think that fits everything in the case. Sir Clinton seemed inclined to dispute this conclusion, but he restrained himself and merely nodded to Wendover to continue. I see your objection, I think, the squire went on. You meant to say, why were both the Shandons murdered when it was only Neville's death that was essential to Hackleton? But there's quite a plausible explanation of that. You can't hang a man twice. So if a man decides to commit a single murder, he might as well commit two. The punishment's the same for a quantity. And if he can commit two with equal impunity, as in the maze, mightn't it occur to him that two murders would be a stiffer problem than one murder, in these particular circumstances? Isn't it the double murder that's giving all the difficulty? Of course it is. If either Shandon had been murdered solus, we'd know at once the line to look up. But at present we don't. Now why shouldn't the murderer have seen that very point and utilized it? Sir Clinton nodded. That's ingenious, Squire. I'm not ironical. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.